Welcome back to the BJJ Fanatics podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Ford. My guest today is a 5th degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He's a black belt world champion, a black belt World Cup champion, an ADCC open weight champion. He's also a retired professional MMA fighter and a veteran of the UFC. He's a legacy MMA light heavyweight champion. He's also undefeated in his MMA career. He was one of the most accomplished members of Team Brasa and now leads his own team, Team Zenith, which has affiliates all over the world. Some of the biggest names in MMA seek his knowledge to improve their jiu-jitsu. He was also a coach on the Ultimate Fighter reality show for Team Mir, Team Joanna, and Team Tate, and also Team Benavides. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be joined today for the 4th time in my podcasting career by Mr. Robert Drysdale. How are you today, Robert?
I'm doing good, Ryan. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. No, it's always a pleasure getting to talk to you, man. Rob, it's. I think the last time we had you on the show was during all the lockdowns and everything. It was 2020. Man, catch us up. What have you been up to in the last few years?
Running the school, teaching class, running the association, working on my books on my free time. That's my sort of become my hobby is reading and writing books. And, it's what I do on my free time. Have my kids on, every other weekend. Life is good. I can't complain, man. This is, retirement has been quite much different from what I expected, but it's just as challenging, just a different kinds of challenge.
I remember last time you were on, we discussed the last book you wrote, which was Opening the Closed Guard. And then now you've written another book, The Rise and Evolution of, in fact, I have it here. Yeah, right here. It's a great book, man. I mean, you really outdid yourself on this one. I think it's truly the best jiu-jitsu history book I've ever read. So huge congratulations for that. What motivated you? Of course, man. What motivated you to want to write the book and tackle the history of this sometimes very confusing martial art when it comes to the historical records that we have?
I think in general, I'm just a very merit-oriented person. It just comes with my personality, my worldview. To me, a meritocracy is it's not something I've ever questioned. It's just like, it goes without saying, And, when you learn something about the history of jiu-jitsu, there's a lot of things that don't stand. There's a lot of marketing. I think martial arts in general just tend to be mythologized. And, I'm just reading all these biographies on Bruce Lee. And it's just not impressive, man. I'm not trying to be a dick. I don't want to insult anyone. I know people get upset over these things, but can someone please tell me what is so impressive about Bruce Lee? It's like, oh, Maeda. Can someone please tell me what is so impressive about Maeda? I don't get it. I just don't get it. And then I'm watching you're reading the facts and you're learning about these characters. Wait, this is all upside down. And then when you read about the history of jiu-jitsu, there's just no way around it. Carlson Gracie is the central figure. No one has done more than him. No one did it better. You want to put a guy to be the GOAT in jiu-jitsu, a guy who actually fought the best guys at his time, trained the best fighters for 3 decades straight, pretty much created the world that we live in. His name is Carlson Gracie. And it's funny, he's one of the least known Gracies because he did nothing to promote himself. And I think that's the key issue here is that, the issue of merit just screams at me, and the issue of marketing it's just not something that was there for Carlson. He just never cared for it. He never had anyone do it for him. So most people don't even know who he is. Yet he's the most important figure in the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Wow. And I say this without it's just not controversial. If anyone thinks this is controversial, is not paying attention to the facts. It's just straight up. There's just no way around it. Yeah. No one did more than him. No one did it better. And he had a vision for exactly the kind of jiu-jitsu we have today, and I argue this in the book. You read it. To be fair, the original idea for the centrality of Carlson Gracie was not mine. It was from Roberto Pedreira, who's actually a professional historian. He's was a life in academia. And it was, he made a comment to me once. It's if you read Shockey's volume 2 and 3, about 2/3 of them are about Carlson. That's when that kind of hit me like a ton of bricks. And I'm like, that's true. This is the guy who was there on the ground doing the heavy lifting, doing the actual work to create the world that we live in. But he got, people just didn't know anything about it. His students did, but their guys are aging. Most of them are in Brazil. No one listens to them. I had students of Carlson students that wrote me and would go, man, my coach has been saying the same thing for 10 years, but I never believed them until I read your book. They didn't believe their own coaches because that can't be true. And then I read your book, Robert. It's this makes a lot of sense. It's pretty much what my coach has been saying for the last 10 years. Yeah. So that was sort of the motivation, was to give Carlson his proper dues and, help explain the rise of jiu-jitsu in the 90s and the role of the IBJJF. I've had my differences with them in the past, but at the end of the day, I mean, they give credibility to the sport. Without them, I think this would have turned into absolute chaos. Yeah. We would have 12-year-old black belts by now. It would have descended much. I mean, there's a watering down of quality of jiu-jitsu in terms of especially the values, but I think that the IBJJF has been a buffer there in that regard, and in terms of keeping the quality and the standards and organization, giving the martial art credibility. So, I give them their props too. It's not politics; it's just the facts as I read them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you zoomed in on Carlson's story, because Carlson's obviously someone that has huge amounts of people that can trace their lineage back to him. And we've heard the stories of him back in the day representing, kind of being the family champion in the Vale Tudo pits of Brazil. Yep. But it's funny because, like you said, he didn't seem like he was very much of a self-promoter. I think a lot of the allure that came around Carlson was from his students. You guys like Ricardo Laborio, Ricardo De La Hiva, Mario Sperry, all those guys. There's a lot of really tough, accomplished fighters and champions that came from him, so you could only assume how good he was. But I think that's awesome that you chose to shed some light on that, since he wasn't much of a self-promoter himself.
I think that the point that people keep missing, because even when you say that, people don't always put two and two together. But I think the argument I make, and it's not explicit in the book, maybe I should have made it explicit, is that the jiu-jitsu that was taught at the Gracie Academy, right? The jiu-jitsu that Carlos and Helio taught was fundamentally different from the one we practice today. What we practice today is Carlson Gracie jiu-jitsu. The beach culture, the flip-flops, the hang loose, the acai after practice, the live rounds, the group classes. Group classes didn't exist at the Gracie Academy. People don't know that. They only had private lessons in self-defense. There were no group classes. There was no live sparring. There was no the kind of intense training for what jiu-jitsu is known for. The ground orientation even is all a product of Carlson's gym. I'll give you, and I speculate this in the book. I don't write it, it's in between the lines, but if you read chapter 8 carefully, I trace down the evolution of the jiu-jitsu rule set. In 1936, you say it's very heavily influenced by boxing. In 54, it starts taking shape away from judo, but it still has a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of ground techniques, ground positioning, and takedowns, right? In 67, that ratio doesnn't change. They remove in 54, they have Osaikomi, Vazari, and Ippon. It's very, very influenced. This is already 24 years after Carlos started splitting from judo, if we put it in 1930, right? So 1954, they have a rule set that's very, very judo-oriented. In 67, they remove Osaikomi, and they remove the Wazari, but they still have a ratio of 1-to-1. 1 point for the back, 1 point for mount, 1 point for takedown. And then in 75, that's when what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu begins to take shape. And this is very clear in the rule set. It was 2 points for passing, 3 for knee on belly, 4 for mount, what I call a progression paradigm, which in reality just mimics an MMA fight. You are rewarded for positions where you could potentially do damage to your opponent, right? You could strike down on your opponent. It's very influenced by MMA. But then the ratio changes. You get 2 points for takedowns, but 4 for mount. 4 for the back. So there's a ground orientation that is very clear in 1975. Now, why did it take 45 years for that to happen? Now, I can't prove this, but I think that given the influence of MMA, of Carlson's MMA, especially in the 1970s, how he was the most influential figure in jiu-jitsu, I think Carlson had something to do with it. I can't prove it, but I think if you look at, given the timing that it took 45 years for this ground orientation for which we are known for today to even take place, I think it'd be surprising if Carlson had nothing to do with it. I mean, 45 years and no ground orientation. They had a 1-to-1 ratio. It was very stand-up oriented. And you see this in footage of Helio. Helio fights Kato. He doesn't pull guard. He stands up. He fights Ono. He doesn't pull guard. He fights Takeo Yano. He doesn't pull guard. I mean, Ono, he got taken down 36 times. How do you get taken down that many times unless you're trying to stand up the whole time? Yeah. Right? These guys, they were judokas. They were not pulling guard. It was like the ground orientation that we have today came afterwards. It came, and in the 1967 rule set, you don't see this. You still see judo there. And then in 75, it's that big leap, pretty much the rule set we have today. 75, the key figure in jiu-jitsu in Brazil is Carlson Gracie. Like, he's the central figure at that point. I'd be surprised if he didn't have anything to do with that. And, and I think when you put 2 and 2 together, I mean, you add the beach culture, the relaxed manners, away from the militaristic style from which like the Gracie Academy was known. I think that what we practice now was born inside Carlson Gracie's gym, and I just don't see a way around it. Like, the more you talk to these old timers, and they say it too, like they're open about it. Oh no, it's completely different. Carlson's gym and the Gracie Academy were like two worlds. I mean, they're just worlds apart. And if you want to see it, if you want to see that today, you can see how the Valenti brothers teach jiu-jitsu. They're very, very, very loyal representation of Helio Gracie's jiu-jitsu, minus the group classes. The group classes did not exist at the Gracie Academy. The Valenti brothers have group classes. They took that from Carlson. But the Gracie Academy had only private lessons, self-defense. And we use the same word. I think this is the confusion comes from, because we use the same word jiu-jitsu to describe two wildly different things. And they are wildly different. It's just that we're using the same word to describe it. Like, see, the Gracie brothers stuck to jiu-jitsu instead of using the modern term judo. Okay, so it's different because it's a different word. Carlson didn't do that. But I think that the split between Gracie Academy and Carlson is just as radical, if not more so, than the split between the Gracie brothers and judo. I think there's a second split there in terms of culture, methodology, and then technical canon that should not be ignored. It's very, very significant, and it pretty much gave shape to what we now call Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
It's incredible, man. I'm really happy that you brought up Chapter 8 because, there's so much great content in this book, but I especially was intrigued by Chapter 8, which detailed the history behind the creation of the Jiu-Jitsu rule set, like you said. So obviously, at some point in time, Carlos and Helio Gracie made the decision to break away from the judo rule set handed down by the Kodokan. And then they also rebelled against the rules that were imposed on them by the Brazilian Boxing Federation, which is something I'd never heard of talked about before. They were obviously overseeing jiu-jitsu events in Rio and throughout Brazil. What do you think the reason was for all this resistance from Carlos and Helio when it came to defining the rules of jiu-jitsu competition?
Ambition, plain and simple. Very ambitious people. Carlos was out to make. He was one of those guys, my way or the highway, and then he was a guy. He was going to make it either with jiu-jitsu. It was going to be with the exoteric. He was really into the supernatural. Like he was just a guy that was out to do it their way. It's us, the Gracie family, and so he is a division. Like when I take Maeda out of the story, because I really don't think Maeda is that relevant. I'm automatically placing Carlos as the central figure in Brazil. I mean, as the inception point, maybe not the central figure, but the inception point, the separation from judo. Not just Cinto Fel, his coach, not Maeda, Carlos. Carlos is the beginning of the story because he has the ambition, the will, and the courage, really, to split apart from judo. I mean, the guy had 21 children. Like, was this part of the vision? It's hard to say, but it definitely worked in his favor. Without an army of 21 children to carry on his vision, you wouldn't have a Carlson, you wouldn't have a Carlos Gracie Jr., who is also, because he's alive, we don't give Carlos Gracie Jr. his credit, but he's extremely important. I argue he's more important than his father. I think that what he's done is just, I said, people underestimate it because you go talk to him. He's a nice guy. He chats with you. You don't see him as a historical figure, but there's no question about his relevance. But I think Carlos had ambition, and Helio, that was Carlos's role, having the ambition to split and create a new environment, a new atmosphere for their version of judo to evolve in. And Helio was the soldier, he was the general that made it all possible, because his strong personality was exactly what you needed to keep the troops cohesive. It's very difficult to get someone, even two people, believing in a vision, rather alone like an entire new world that they were creating. Not only the family itself, but their students. They had a vision, they stuck to it, and they were very true to the core of, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it different. We're going to do it better. And this is what's going to be done. And this is what, at a time when no one was paying attention. And this is what I think is, and I've said this before, I think it's the greatest contribution of the Gracie family to jiu-jitsu, particularly Carlos, Helio, and some of the older generation, is that they stuck to their view of how they were going to do things, and they didn't deviate. And that's think about it. Imagine you had a business that was failing for 5 decades. 5 decades, and no one cares. No one's paying attention, and they're still at it. Like, no, it's going to work. It's going to work. It's going to work. Talk about persistence.
Yeah.
And people ignore that. And they're talking about Helio invented the guard. I'm like, stop it, people. Stop with the nonsense. Kosen Judo was 40, 50 years ahead of Brazilians in terms of, the sophistication of techniques. Like, stop it with the nonsense. But what they did do is funny, is that they don't always give themselves credit for, which is the resilience to stay true to a given worldview and until it panned out eventually in 93. And then they were like, see, we told you it was going to work. That was sort of like not said, but that was sort of like the attitude. So I think that's incredible. I think it's a super interesting story. The more you learn about it, the more interesting it becomes.
Kind of on that note, something else I found really intriguing was that you mentioned that essentially the Gracie brothers, ultimately they had their own vision and they seemed to know where they wanted to take their art. But at the end of the day, they needed what judo had. They needed their students to be motivated by the ability to compete and test themselves and earn prestige by being awarded medals at tournaments. But what I found fascinating was that you pointed out that by filling this need to keep students engaged and ultimately grow their brand and their academy, it would inherently set things in motion to diverge from the reality of combat that their original jiu-jitsu was supposed to be centered around. Would you mind elaborating on that a little bit? Like, how did that kind of become a double sword in some way?
One of the central arguments for parting from judo is that judo was becoming excessively sportive, right? And the real judo, the real jiu-jitsu was disappearing, right? So they didn't know real jiu-jitsu because none of them trained it. What Carlson and Helio trained was judo. They just modified it, right? But they did have a point. Judo had become excessively sportive because the second you create a rule set, right? Competitors are not idealists; they're winners. So they're going to win in any way they can by manipulating the rules as best they can in order to, achieve victory. So, but the Gracie brothers, they had a vision that was reality combat oriented. Now, you can disagree with some of their ideas of what real combat was, but the premise of pegging, their judo to the reality of combat was there. No one can dispute that. They had that concern. I mean, much later, Carlson's the one who's really going to fuse the two. But the vision of having their judo be grounded in the reality of combat is uncontroversial. It's just there. It's there for everyone to see. However, how do you grow a sport without competition? I mean, I'm reading about Jeet Kune Do right now. Like Jeet Kune Do, my opinion, they failed to create a league, even if it were a great martial art. I don't think it is, but there's a lot of problems with it. But, when you catch wrestling, they failed to create a broad league. I mean, catch wrestling did it before judo did. I mean, they did it before everyone, but unless you organize yourself into a cohesive, a league, it's very difficult to grow. And I think either for financial reasons or for having the vision, the understanding that if they wanted to grow, they would have to tread the path of judo. They were caught between a rock and a hard place, because how do you grow without numbers, without competition? You don't see martial arts growing. Martial arts that become popular all have competition as a background. You can pay attention, like they have a competitive ethos to them, because that's what keeps people coming back. People enjoy competition. It gives prestige and makes people want to watch and go to, train harder, and evolves the art. Competition evolves the art. So they create a competitive environment in 1967, right? They create a league, like a federation. But now they're making the same, they start becoming judo. And now we're watching this. Now we sort of became what we used to criticize, because shin to shin guard was unthinkable in the 80s. You know why? Because on Fridays at Carlson's gym, on Fridays with Hollis and Saturdays with Carlson, you get slapped in the ear, because they had taparia, which was jiu-jitsu with slaps, right? Not quite combat jiu-jitsu, but similar idea. And that was to keep your jiu-jitsu grounded in the reality of combat, not doing something that would not work in a fight, right? So these guys had that concern. But, it was the competition scene was still, there was a cultural buffer that prevented them from doing sophisticated guards like shin to shin, not just a taparia. Like Royler Gracie describes an incident with his father when he was playing some kind of guard that wouldn't work in a fight. And his father, Helio, corrected him, like, don't do that. That wouldn't work in a fight. So he stopped doing it. So there was almost like there was a pressure there not to do things that would not work in a fight, even though they were legal in competition. Well, there's a conflict there. How can you say something that is, the culture says this, but the rules say something else? And that conflict finally became like unbearable in the 90s. I mean, once jiu-jitsu blew up, everyone's like, screw the culture, screw judo tradition, screw taparia, we're going to win tournaments here. All right. And that became the IBJJF model for competition that, for all its benefits, and there are many, does follow in the path of judo, as in the sense of removing itself from the reality of combat. I mean, deep half guard is unthinkable. I mean, you watch the guys, even the high level guys today. I mean, what part of what they're doing resembles a real fight? Like it's almost unrecognizable. And when I started training jiu-jitsu, I started in 98. Jiu-jitsu was preparation for MMA. That's all jiu-jitsu was. Jiu-Jitsu was meant to prepare you for fight. I trained Jiu-Jitsu to prepare myself for the UFC. That's why I was training Jiu-Jitsu. There was no other reason. Like, why medals were cool and everything, but it was in the world. I mean, in the early 2000s, that starts to change. It becomes a world in and of itself. And now, I mean, my students who watch Jiu-Jitsu don't care about the UFC. My students who care about the UFC don't care about Jiu-Jitsu. They're completely separate. But in the late 90s, they were one and the same thing. And I think that that's a contradiction that no martial art can solve, because if you want to grow in terms of popularity, you're going to have competition. You're going to have to open it to more demographics. I talk about this in the book too. The more you open it to more demographics, the more you're going to lower the standards, because not everyone's going to have that Spartan ethos of being to the gym and getting, training like an animal and getting slapped and having that sort of like warrior spirit. You want moms and dads and children to train. That's great. But you're going to lose some credibility in the process. And and there's no way around that. That's not a jiu-jitsu problem. It's not a judo problem. It's a martial art problem. No one can solve it because there is a conflict there. And I think that in some ways, like we are still like cruising on the coattails of a credibility that we won in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, through the reality of combat. But whether we care to admit it or not, we're distancing ourselves from it because we need to sell. We want to grow. We want to expand. We want to become popular. But now we're sort of becoming what we used to criticize. So that's sort of like the book's about that as well. And I'm not trying to be pessimistic here. I think I come across as a negative person a lot, but I think sometimes at the cost of speaking truthfully, you're going to come across as negative. I mean, it's reality. I think we have to be honest here as to what is happening and not delude ourselves because it benefits us. You have to make a decision whether you care more about truth than you care about winning. And at some point, because those things are always in conflict, being truthful is not always in tune with doing what's best for you, So, and I think that if we want what's best for jiu-jitsu, we have to lean towards what the reality of the situation is, so we can have an honest discussion of where we're at and where we're going. Because not many people are willing to have that honest discussion because the money's too good to challenge that. So everyone's like, shh, let's not talk about it, Robert. Talking too much. But like,
you're screwing it all up, man. Yeah.
Yeah, but like there is something to be said about, Jiu-Jitsu was the premier martial art inside a cage in the 90s. I mean, what happened? We have more practitioners. What happened? We're barely represented in the UFC. Sure, everyone trains, but everyone trains boxing too. Like everyone trains everything. But like as far as, the martial art that actually is breeding the most UFC champions, it's wrestling by far, because they kept that spirit. When I talk to wrestlers, I try to describe like what you guys do is what we used to do in the 90s in Brazil. Like the training sessions were 2-3 hours. It was a different kind. The methodology was very, very primitive. It still is, in my opinion. Wrestling's methodology is much, much better. But I think in terms of like how people viewed like the combat, the Spartan ethos, as I always say, like that was very present in jiu-jitsu in the 90s. It's gone. Like you see people crying over belts now. That was unthinkable. To ask for a belt, like to blame your coach for losing, it's unthinkable. Market yourself, promote yourself after a victory, it was unthinkable. It was embarrassing. So I think that the loss, and I'll gladly take the label of old school, not in terms of techniques. I think in technical terms, jiu-jitsu's evolution has been outstanding. It's been great. But in terms of values, we've gone backwards a lot. I think in terms of values, it's descended a lot.
What you were saying earlier brings up a question that I had, and I was thinking this while I was reading the book. Post-early UFC era, the say late 90s, early 2000s, Grandmaster Elio was widely known as the patriarch of the side of the Gracie family that heavily insisted on self-defense application. His son Horian, who today is Grandmaster himself, sells the UFC, launches arguably the most successful schools and affiliations in the world, focusing exclusively on self-defense jiu-jitsu, and that is heavily focused on the reality of combat. So a lot of people know this. I think that many people would be surprised to hear that Elio himself was responsible for the foundational tournament rules that set the sport in motions, because his sons and grandsons since then have been pretty publicly separated from that. They've separated their brand from that whole idea of sport jiu-jitsu. So what happened there, do you think? What made them eventually, I guess, oppose the very rules that they did themselves set in motion back in the day?
I think Helio lived the conflict. He saw what judo was doing. He saw that challenging people and beating up in their gyms was not the best way to grow the sport. Tournaments are, at the end of the day, they are profitable, so there's money to be made. They wanted credibility, so they had to have a federation. But the second you create a rule set, you created a mirror version of jiu-jitsu. If their original version was self-defense oriented, right, with an influence of volley judo, then the second version was much closer to judo in terms of structure and being a sport of practice. Like, you're going to have a rule set. People are going to fight for it. You're going to create advantages. People are going to fight for advantages. You're going to put a time limit. People are going to stall, and that's true in every sport, not just jiu-jitsu. Like, there's just no way around these things. And I think he lived the conflict and I think the cultural buffer for a long time. This is one thing. Carlson and Helio were always at war with each other, but the one thing they agreed on was that jiu-jitsu should work in a fight. If it didn't work in a fight, it was not real jiu-jitsu. It was not what they were interested in. But at the same time, they created a rule set. So I think they all, they were that cultural buffer, trying to remind guys, hey, it's good that we compete, but if you're doing something that doesn't work in a fight, that's not good. But in the 90s, that all went downhill. In the 90s, it was like you couldn't stop it anymore. It's like, okay, so that's when the Cambrian explosion really took place. I think Chris Howder calls it a Cambrian explosion. I borrow that term from him all the time. That's exactly what happened in the 90s. Because once you remove those cultural buffers, you remove the slaps. I'm like, okay, shin to shin, deep half guard. And that's when you start seeing all these we call modern guards evolve, because they were unthinkable in a setting where you can get hit. You understand? So, and then you have both. You can have popularity and coolness and trendy stuff, but then you're becoming less and less realistic in that process. Not that I'm an advocate. I say this because I'm not an advocate of self-defense. I think most self-defense out there that I see at least wouldn't work in a fight. Some stuff is empirical and functional, but the question I always ask is like, okay, if you see a move, someone show a self-defense move, I always go like this: have you seen that in the UFC? And if the answer is no, there's a very, very good chance that move wouldn't work in a real fight. My idea of self-defense, if you want to, there's very difficult to create an ideal self-defense system because there are too many variables, right? Slippery floor, curb, table, bottle, friends, guns, knives, like infinite variables. You can't really prepare. But the closest thing to it, I think we can agree, is MMA. And MMA has it's because it's more complete. It has like the most functional moves. The UFC has tested what works and what doesn't work. So if you don't see it in the UFC, more likely than not, the move you're learning for self-defense would not work in a real situation. Because if it did, you would see it in the UFC.
When I hear people from self-defense focused martial arts who always say, oh, well, what you see in MMA isn't reality. There's a ref there. There's rules. In the streets, there's no rules. It's kind of like, dude, if you remove rules and everything, okay, now you're taking a guy who boxes all the time, does jiu-jitsu full time, wrestles his ass off, and now you're going to fight that guy, no rules, and you think that somehow because you poke people in the eyes in your system that this guy's not going to kill you. It's just like
it's a gap argument, right? You find that little corner because no one's going to put you in a situation where people can eye gouge each other. So you can hide there and say, see, if I could eye gouge you, I would win, but it's funny. A lot of the people that stand by this, that they don't want to enter tournaments because they get nervous. They get scared. It's difficult to enter a tournament. It's a huge challenge. And they can't believe, man, you can't deal with the anxiety and controlling your emotions in a situation where there's a referee, there's soft mats, there's a paramedic right there, there's rules, there's everyone to protect you. And you're telling me when there's a real life endangering situation, you're going to have the cojones to react? Like, man, you can't even enter a tournament. How are you going to protect yourself? I mean, the tournament is preparation for that, if anything. If you want to be safe out there, you should learn how to react when someone's actively trying to beat you. And manage your emotions in the process, which is extremely difficult. I never learned how to do that. I'm not saying it's easy. I was shitting my pants every single one of my fights, from the very first one to the very last. Shitting my pants every time. But it's got to be done if you want to say I'm a martial artist and I want to hold my own. So I'm very skeptic of people that are overly theoretical about their approach to combat. I'm an empiricist in that regard. If you don't see it in the lab, which is the UFC, if you don't see it in there, chances are it wouldn't work in a fight. Yeah. And that goes for jiu-jitsu too. That goes for a lot of sport jiu-jitsu. I think berimbolos are gorgeous. I think they're absolutely beautiful to watch. Every time I see them, I'm like, man, that was so cool. Yeah. But I know that doesn't work in a fight. Maybe one in a million. One guy did it, but if you don't, what works in a fight is a right hand, a left hook, single leg, double leg, kimura, head and arm, rear naked choke. Keep it simple. Simple works. There's a reason why wrestling is so successful. It's simple.
Well, to give credit where credit's due, that's another thing the Gracies really can be credited for, is that, you were talking about the theoretical nature of a lot of self-defense systems and martial arts that existed, and how they'd say, oh, if you did that, we'd poke your eyes. It's like, well, okay, how often are you poking each other in the eye? Like, are you really, like, is that something you actually train and drill? Like, it seems like you wouldn't have people to train with for very long. And the Gracies, when they showed up, they issued the Gracie Challenge. When they came to the U.S., they said, hey, whatever martial art you do, meet us here, or we'll meet you there and we'll film it and we'll just have a fight, no rules. And it very quickly showed what works and what doesn't. And so that's another huge credit to the Gracie family that they did on the ground back in the day. Let me ask you this. There's an excerpt from your book here. I'm going to read it directly from the book because I really like the way you said this. You said, if on one hand competition creates the necessity for better athletes, technical improvisation, adaptation, and hence evolution, then on the other, this does not mean that this evolution is necessarily being steered towards the reality of combat that their jiu-jitsu was meant to embody in its original version. I love the way you said that, because without the sport of jiu-jitsu, things that you and I both mutually agree are beautiful, like berimbolos and things like that, shin to shin guard, things like that, they wouldn't have been evolved and developed and become part of what we use in the sport all the time when we train day to day. Do you think at the end of the day that the growth of that side of jiu-jitsu, even though it's been taken away from the point of martial arts, which is fighting and self-defense, do you feel that it did, at the end of the day, create something worthwhile?
That's a question of purpose, Ryan. I mean, there are people that find purpose in playing the flute.
Yeah.
There are people that purpose playing video games. Who am I to judge?
Sure.
Like, if people find purpose, you're here on this world for X amount of years, right? You don't even know how long. You do what you want. You do what you like. I've changed a lot in the sense where I think for a big portion of my life, I was at war with the world, wanting the world to be as I saw it. Because I was right. Of course I'm right. Everyone right. Everyone believes I'm right. I thought I was right too. So I'm gonna give you my truth, and you should think the way I do. And why don't you think the way I do? It's quite totalitarian, really. That you should tell people how to think. And even if I feel that I'm right about some things, and I think I got points, I've given this a lot of thought. I'm not the most studious guy, but I do my reading. Like I've dived into the sources. I've read everyone worth reading over and over and over. I think there's a lot of things that don't add up, but I don't think people should see things the way I do. I think if people like berimbolos, and if tomorrow they want to add lapels to the elbows and the shoulders and the knees and the hips to even more cool moves, even more, why not? Might add some extra lapels while we're at it. I mean, you can. Why not? I mean, you can. It's even cooler. But I'm just looking at that and I'm going, why would I practice something that is fun but doesn't work in a fight? Or when I can practice something that is fun also, like Khabib Jiu-Jitsu. Khabib is an outstanding representative of old school Jiu-Jitsu. Now, you can call it Sambo if he likes. I don't care. Call it whatever you want. The way he fights is like, that's it. That's what we were supposed to be doing. That was the Carlson's vision. Strike, takedown, ground and pound, submissions. Khabib, he's an outstanding representative of the mentality that this is why Khabib's my favorite fighter of all time, not just for his morals, for his character, but also for him as a fighter. Also, I think there's an element of truth in this. I think it's deceitful to be doing things that aren't real. Like, I think truth, if reality is to be upheld in everything you do, I think that includes how you fight. Right, Jigoro Kano there's something very interesting. It might have been the first one, but he emphasized this. So I think it's worth mentioning him as a precursor because this was important to him. He writes about it. The life lessons carry over to the mats and vice versa. Mat lessons carry over to life. If we are to be truthful in life, we have to be truthful on the mats. If we are to be truthful on the mats, we have to be truthful in life, right? I think truth is a good thing. So if that is true, if that's the case, that these things carry over and these concepts, they should engulf all aspects of our life beyond just like, everywhere. So if you're going to attempt to be honest in life, you should be honest on the mats. And I think that a reality approach view to combat is what honest is. Like, this is reality. Like, why do something fake if we can do something real? Right, it's just as fun. You don't tell me you tell me that if you move berimbolos and shin to shin guard jiu-jitsu wouldn't be fun. Are you kidding me? Have you ever trained jiu-jitsu with strikes? It's great.
Yeah,
it's great. It's more fun, But it's to each their own. I'm not saying people shouldn't. I think that the way jiu-jitsu has evolved has been in general beneficial. But and this is where I'll disagree with everyone. Is like, We could have done that. Everything we're doing, plus remain true to the reality of combat. And we would have been just as successful with more credibility, maybe less money. And that's the corrupting aspect of jiu-jitsu, right? It becomes so money obsessed. It used to be a religion, right? One of our interviewees describes it as a cult. We were missionaries for in the name of a cult. The jiu-jitsu was like a cult. We have to make this the most popular martial art in the world. And now it's become a crazy race for money. Who's going to make more money? It's like, dude, I like money too, but hold up, people. Hold up. Is that really what it's all about? Like, I like it. Sure, I work for it. I'm not going to be a hypocrite saying I don't, but I think this obsession is like deteriorating in so many different ways. It's so corrupting. I know these guys, man. I saw these guys going from, Brazil. You're in Brazil. They're like riding their bikes to the gym and other millionaires. And it's just like something changed along the ways. I mean, I don't think you're better for it. I'm happy for your success, but I don't think you're a better human for it. I think that we've descended a lot from what we used to be in so many different ways. But I mean, again, that's my view. I don't expect people to agree with me or think I'm right. It's just, it's how I see things. I think, a truthful approach to the reality of combat, a truthful approach to training in general is, I think there's a lesson there. And I think that, if you are to uphold these standards, then they should hold them everywhere, not just off the mats, but on the mats as well.
Very well said, man. Also, I hope no one takes you up on your idea to add lapels to shoulders and elbows, because, man, I'm struggling with jiu-jitsu enough as it is. The more complicated it gets, the more I'm going to suffer, man. So hopefully no one...
Right. And here's the thing, though. If it sells, someone will, because and this has been the biggest mistake. And this one, people can disagree with me if they want. But when this whole submission-only thing started, right, I said, this is a mistake. I just called it like 10 years ago, and I called it, this is a mistake, because this is not real. This is whatever you guys are doing here. It's removing us from the reality of combat. And then this is what people's comeback was. But Rob, it's fun to watch. And I go, sure, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Personally, I don't think it's more entertaining, but to each their own. People can disagree. But since when do martial arts have to do with entertainment? Can someone please explain to me, when was it that we stopped worrying about reality and we started making fun and entertainment? We put fun and entertainment in the driver's seat. Like, when did we do that? Why does entertainment even matter? Right? I mean, I watch Dave Chappelle for entertainment. To me, like, when I go to the gym, I'm trying to improve on myself mentally, physically, technically. When on the weekends, when I watch fights, I'm fascinated by the technical aspects. I can watch who's number one and go, whoa, man, that was gorgeous. That was beautiful. But it's the efficiency of the move that fascinates me, not whether the gossip and the blah, 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 and the talking and the circus, right? And I don't know if you notice this, right, but I start my book with the circus. The very opening of the book is a circus. And the point is, like, we've gone full circle. Like, the idea of entertainment and reality in martial arts, these ideas have always been battling each other. And I think entertainment is winning the fight now. And if entertainment truly wins the fight, then we go full circle back to the circus, back to where we began. And look at catch wrestling. It turned into pro wrestling. There was a very lively scene. People don't know this. This isn't Pedrera's new book. These people were putting 10,000 people in an arena in the 1930s. 10,000 people in an arena. The fight purses were $48,000 in today's money. Some fight purses going up to $48,000. It was huge. The grappling scene in the 1930s in the U.S. was huge. It's very popular. You can argue maybe more popular than it is now. But once you put the customer in the driver's seat and you lose track of what's important, now you're going in what direction? You give them more and more of what they want. Entertain, feed me more. Like that. It's like the McDonald's supersize me. Give me more fries, more sugar, more junk, more. There's no end to it, right? You supersize me. Like, you get this, and now you get the deterioration of something that used to have super high standards. You understand? And then once you go down that route, you lose credibility. And circus is one example. Pro wrestling is the other. And I worry that some of these promoters are so worried about selling tickets that they're dragging the quality of the martial arts down with them. It's in the name of entertainment, and I don't think entertainment is a good metric. The more I think about it, it's like, man, like, judo has been remained the most, judo and wrestling, like, they have super high standards. They've been around forever. I don't think there's some level of entertainment, but I think that in general, they've held themselves to higher standards over the years. I don't think that, this obsession with, like, popularize jiu-jitsu is necessarily good. You can have something that's unpopular and highly efficient and with more credibility. What is the point? Is the point to have credibility and grow and help the student develop, place them in an environment where the standards are super high and you can actually elevate them as a human, or is it just get rich? Because at some point these things are all in conflict. They're not always in conflict, but sometimes they are. I think that in jiu-jitsu, I think we don't always have the right measurement of what success is, in my opinion. I think in some ways we're going backwards, even though we're becoming more popular.
Wow. Rob, there's something you said there, man, that I'd like to pick your brain on, because I'm surprised you said it, actually. You said that you felt that the movement towards submission only was a mistake. Now, is that because of the entertainment aspect that comes along with it? It's obviously the rule set. I would imagine that, focusing on the essence of jiu-jitsu, which is to submit your opponent, would be a direction that you'd probably like to see it move.
Some things I like about it. Like, I'm not going to be completely. I wrote an article about this. I picked a huge fight with like ADCC and Mo a while back. I wrote an article that was critical about IBJJF, critical about IDCC, critical about submission only. And all three also had some things I liked about these rule sets. So it was not out of criticism, out of hate. It was out of like, this is where we're at. This is what I think should change. This is what I think is, worthwhile. This is what I think is bad. In the case of submission only, I think submission only they simplified it. Like, anyone can referee submission only. That's a beautiful thing. Like, literally, anybody, you get my mom and a referee a submission only match tomorrow. IBJJF is hard. Like, I have a hard time. I've been doing this for 26 years, and I can't tell you I've mastered their rules. It's incredibly complex, because the more situations, the more, and the rule book is already at 52 pages, and it's likely to grow over the years because it's never stopped growing, but submission only fits in a page. It's very simple, but it's the idea that it's all about the submission bothers me. And I'll tell you why. I think if jiu-jitsu is to be a fight, positioning is just as important, perhaps. If we look at the UFC statistics, I don't have numbers at hand, but if we looked, I suspect, I could be wrong here, but I suspect there are more TKOs on the ground than submissions.
Yeah, probably.
Which says something about position. Like, turtle position should be points when you think about it. It's the ultimate striking position. You can hit, beat the crap, so these positions are super valuable in a fight. Holding someone down, knowing how to control a takedown, hold them down. And you're watching these guys fall back. My students are being absorbed by it. So I talk about the importance of not losing top position, right? Because in a fight, you would want to be on top, right? My students don't care. They just fall on their backs. They're throwing themselves back. And what they forget is that what gave Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the edge over other grappling arts was precisely positioning. If you watch catch wrestling, their arsenal of submissions has always been greater than Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Still is. Like, they have like infinite amount of submissions. A lot of them don't probably work, but like there's a huge arsenal there. But I think they never emphasize back takes and guard passing and sweeping like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artists did because of the 1970 rule set. The 1975 rule set was revolutionary because it gave a hyper focus on quality positions that could award you a victory in a real fight. So 4 points for mount, 4 points for the back. It's clearly influenced by Vale Tudo, MMA, clearly, right? And that, I think, gave Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu the edge in combat for a long time, because Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was not the only grappling art in the world, but we have held the edge in terms of winning on the ground for decades. We still do because of position. I think if you remove positioning, I think that we're going to slowly start becoming less and less martial as a result, even if it is more fun to watch, and then the other thing too, people say, oh, but this sport, there's more money in the sport. Sure. But who's making more money? Like 1% of the community, 0.1. Like, is that benefiting jiu-jitsu that half a dozen people are making money from tickets? I don't think the sport as a whole benefits, right? But again, people disagree, but I don't think that, I don't think that, although selling tickets and popularization is good, but not at the cost of lowering standards and making jiu-jitsu less martial and losing credibility in the process.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would argue to that point, I would argue that it does provide a trajectory, though, for young athletes. So if you have like kids coming up that want to try to earn cash prizes and make a living through jiu-jitsu, would it not just provide an additional vehicle that they could support themselves as they pursue becoming professional jiu-jitsu athletes in the future?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying the question is, why can't we have that and be truthful to our roots? Is it contradictory? Are they two mutually exclusive? I don't think they are. I just think that when there is a conflict, I think that the credibility and reality of combat and efficiency and these values that I defend, these things should have preeminence. They should be in the driver's seat. The problem is when you make entertainment the highest achievement, or popularization, like monetization. When you do that, I think that when there is that conflict, you're moving in the wrong direction. You're moving in, the tendency, if you keep making those decisions, right, and you always lean towards ticket sales popularity, you will become more and more like pro wrestling, because guess what? Pro wrestling sells way more than jiu-jitsu. How far do we go down that road is my question. I mean, we're talking about extremes here, okay? I'm just saying there's a push and pull there, and you can see this clearly. We're living it right now. We're in the middle of it, so sometimes it's hard to see, but 50 years from now, 100 years from now, where historians are studying this moment, they're going to see this push and pull. It's very, very clear that there's a portion of the community that wants to be more like judo. There's a portion of the community that wants to be like boxing. And there's a conflict there. And I think if there is a line drawn between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and the Nogi version of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, call it American Jiu-Jitsu, I think it's a silly term, but it's that. It's a culture. What is the purpose of what we do? And I mean, I think my generation saw things very differently. Whereas the new generation is like its popularization is the ultimate metric. Like they literally measure you by your financials. I mean, you're to me, it was a success on the mats is all that mattered, but it's a different time. And I get that part. I don't think people should agree with me, but I think that if the book does anything, it's to alert us to the fact that we are losing something very valuable in the process. And I think that shouldn't be ignored. I think we should at least have a discussion like, wait a second, what is it that we're gaining and what is it that we're losing? Change is good. Evolution is inevitable. Times have changed, sure. But do we have to throw the baby out with the water? I think that's the central theme of the book. Is Carlson was such an exceptional representative of the mentality that I defend. Raiz Jiu-Jitsu. In Raiz versus Nutella, like we become very Nutella. Wokeness. People don't want to say it. I think wokeness has made its way into jiu-jitsu. It's deeply entrenched in jiu-jitsu culture. It was unthinkable to blame someone for your loss when coaches would literally yell at us, call us stupid for losing a match. Today, you got to tell your student he's awesome after he lost, otherwise he's gonna cry. He's going to get upset. It's gotten soft. It's gotten very, very soft. And it's not a jiu-jitsu problem. It's a world problem. Jiu-jitsu has given in. Jiu-jitsu has, they have fallen in with the trends instead of being a bastion of strength that I always held jiu-jitsu to be. Like, jiu-jitsu is different. This is why. It's merit-based. It's accountable. You can't BS and you can't cry if you lose. But these things are making their way into the sport.
There's something else. There's something you said there a second ago that I really appreciated. You mentioned the importance of understanding the positions. We were talking about submission only versus points there. I love that you said that because you're right. Like if you score mount or you take the back or you get to side control, those are very relative positions, and they have value because in a fight you'd be in trouble. Like if strikes were included and all that. And that was one of my frustrations I used to have talking to like people that are real self-defense oriented. Is like, oh well, the points of tournaments and stuff. It's like, yeah, but those positions do have a lot of meaning, man. For the reasons that you like jiu-jitsu. Like if it's self-defense and fighting,
I'll give you another one. And anyone who thinks that submission is a great idea in a real fight has never been in a real fight. I mean, you're assuming, and this might be a Brazilian thing, you're assuming a dual format, right? When I was a kid and you got into a fight in school, which was all the time, the kids will make a circle. It's kind of like an octagon. Yeah. And you will go at it. No one intervened. Even adults. I remember adults just like sitting back and like letting kids handle it. Yeah. And unless no one was getting seriously hurt, no one intervened. And then someone would tap, quit, or if someone got hurt, they would stop, and that determined the victor. But people wouldn't intervene, right? But there's an assumption that no one's going to intervene. In my experience in the U.S., and I've seen some altercations, it doesn't work that way. No one makes a circle and says no one gets in. Like when Rickson fought Hugo Duarte at the beach, no one's intervening. Their friends are there watching, but they're not. And they're saying it in Portuguese, no one intervenes. And people would say that in a fight, no one intervenes, because there was a constant reminder for people not to intervene, right? In that situation, that environment, then submission is a great idea. Sure. Is that a real self-defense situation, or is that artificial for a circle of people to go around? Let's say the real self-defense situation would not have any standards, would not have any rules, would not have a cultural buffer of people in a circle saying don't intervene, right? So I think it's going for a submission in a bar fight is the dumbest thing you can do. I mean, the best form of self-defense in a bar fight is track and field. Second best is boxing, hit and run. Jab, right hand, get the hell out of Dodge. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to take someone, you really want to be on someone's back in a nightclub? Think about it. Yeah. With random people kicking your head. So like there's all these misconceptions people have about combat and self-defense. I think self-defense is such a broad category, you can barely talk about it. I am very suspicious of everyone with a self-defense system saying, oh, this is a great, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Krav Maga, you name it, Kung Fu, I don't care. Like, I'm extremely suspicious. Most of it is not even tried. It's not empirical. It's just theoretical. I think the closest thing to a functional system, it's not a system, but would be a professional MMA fighter. That guy is the most qualified person to hold his own in a real situation, regardless of the variables. He is still better prepared than the guy who's been trained to unarm you his whole life. Like, that MMA fighter is still better qualified because his reaction time, his speed, his reflexes, his quick thinking, his emotional control is second to none. MMA athletes are by far the best fighters the world's ever seen. There's no one better than MMA fighters ever. Yeah. They're light years ahead of everyone. So why reinvent the wheel? Right hand, left hook, single leg, double leg. It may not be entertaining to some people, but it is what works. Look at Khabib, look at the best guys. They keep it simple. And it works. You know, we associate, because we think jiu-jitsu is like an iPhone. Right? We tend to think that the 12 is better than the 11 is better than the 10. It's like, so the more stuff you add to it, the better it is. And that might be true for an iPhone or your computer, but that's not necessarily true in a fight. And the Carlson was big on this. It's like the less parts to break, the less likely it is to work. You want something with very few. There's a reason why the AK-47 is the rifle of rifles. The Glock is the handgun of handguns. Like, there's less parts to break, man. The simpler it is, the less likely it is to break. And I'm watching these long sequences that people are doing on Instagram because my algorithm is bombarded with it because I watch it because I'm like mostly critical. I'm like, that would never work, you know. but they have all these long sequences, and I'm like, when did you ever see that? It's kata. You know, kata in karate. We're doing kata. Like, we don't call it kata, but it's kata. You got this long ass sequence that's coordinated. That, like, I mean, could a fight? I mean, is it worth to learn to move that way? Kata has a purpose. I'm not saying kata doesn't have a purpose. Sure. But be careful with that, not to think that that is what is going to happen in a fight, because, you know, it's normally the simple stuff that works. Even at the high level in jiu-jitsu, the highlight is the berimbolo. But if you watch what's going on in the entire match, the vast majority of it is just simple and to the point. It's not sophisticated. It's just that we hyper-focus on the highlight, which is 100% of what we see. So it becomes the whole story. It's confirmation bias, right? But, you know, and I think that if you were to be like very methodical about analyzing jiu-jitsu, you would see that the stuff that is, I mean, statistically most consistent is the stuff that it is simple. It's not necessarily old school or new school. It's not to the point. But it's stuff that has very few breaking parts.
I couldn't agree with you anymore about MMA being the best thing you could be doing. Someone that's actually fighting and competing, or at least training often in MMA. I think that really is your best bet for self-defense, because we talked earlier about, like, you know, the eye gouging and the throat grabbing and all that kind of stuff, the nut kicking. That's all fine and dandy, but you can't possibly be training that to where it's muscle memory and to where it's, you know, you can't train that against a resisting opponent and still have people that want to show up and train with you on a Tuesday. So I feel like the guys that are there training realistic things that they can train with someone who's either completely resisting, like jiu-jitsu, or boxing, where it's like, you know, 50 to 60% resistance in training, in normal training and sparring situations. I think it's going to be better off than just saying, hey, well, you know, if someone did this, I would grab their throat, or I'd kick their nuts, or I'd poke their eyes. It's like, It's like, that's a lot of theory, man.
But I think it's a convenient lie because it makes you feel good. You know, now you can just tell yourself, you can pat yourself on the back, and you can go, oh, see, I would really beat that UFC fighter if I could eye gouge him. I'm like, yeah, sure. Tell yourself that, buddy. As much as you are, you're going to beat Francis Ngannou in a fight. Yeah, good luck with that. You know, like, but it's. I think that martial arts is the biggest, like, hub for hoaxsters and, like, phonies. Like, I mean, because other professions you couldn't do this. You get called on it. You get put in prison for But martial arts, you literally get away with anything. So it's just, and the more I learn about this, it's always funny. Like the real people, like Carlson, is like the guy's like, dude, this is the guy. This is the standard here, man. I'm a fan. I don't hide it. And then you get people like praising Bruce Lee. I'm like, what the hell did Bruce Lee do? It was so impressive. Can someone please explain to me? I'm not trying to insult the guy or his family or his friends or his fans, but it's just not. It's crazy to me that you could put Ivan Gomez and Bruce. Like, no, so wait a second, man. Ivan Gomez was like, dude. Or even like the average UFC fighter today. Like these guys are 20 times the martial artist Bruce Lee will ever be. I'll talk about philosophy. I'm just reading a book like just plagiarism. Like all what he called this philosophy was just plagiarized through and through. Anyway, people just have like low standards of I think it's the hero worshiping. That's what it comes down to. People just need someone to look up to. Like, you want to compare Rickson Gracie to Carlson. Are you crazy? You have to be insane to compare the records of the two, of Carlson Gracie and Rickson. You have to be on a different planet. I'm sorry. As a coach, as a fighter, you can't. You simply cannot. There's an abyss in terms of accomplishments. But people worship Rickson and they don't even know who Carlson is. Just look at the track record, guys. Don't take my word for it. Look at the track record as a coach and as a fighter. Look at the track record. It's insanity. So to me that was my motivation, man. Like we're living in a world where marketing is there. Like, man, dude, it's just, if it's merit is all that matters. That's the standard right there. Always. It's all about merit.
Well, man, again, Rob, you really did a stellar job on this book, man. You laid out the history unlike anyone I've ever seen with this book. So congratulations again. I really do recommend it to any student out there to pick it up. If you're passionate about jiu-jitsu, it's really good to know the history of the art that you train. So go get a copy. Again, The Rise and Evolution of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by Robert Drysdale, available Amazon. Robert, where else can people pick it up? Is it mostly Amazon?
Amazon, closeguardfilm.com. If you're in Brazil, clubedosautores.com. We have amazon.com.br. You can get the first book in Portuguese as well. Because I get bombarded with Brazilian readers who they can't find the books. I say this all the time. No? But Amazon is probably the most common source. It delivers in a few days. And I appreciate the kind words, Ryan. I thank you for having me back. And I just want to say one thing. I apologize if I offended anyone. I tend to speak truthfully. As a result, I'm going to come across as an asshole half the time, and I'm sorry. I don't mean to apologize. I don't mean to offend. It's not my intention. But I think that even if you love something, you're critical of it. Like you cannot, as a coach, I cannot be a good coach by telling you great things about yourself. I have to tell you, I got to give you the shit. I got to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, and I think that's my approach to life. So I apologize if I offended anyone with my comments here. It's not my intention to offend. The intention is to challenge and hopefully get you thinking differently and start a conversation about things that are interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, then I always appreciate you just being direct and honest and open with the way you think, man. So I don't feel you owe an apology to anybody personally, but I do appreciate you always just saying things how you feel, and it's always great to talk with you. I know you got to teach a class, so I'm going to skip the pummel game with you here. There is something I want to talk to you about, though. Another project that I've really been enjoying of yours is one of your instructionals that you filmed with us. It's been helping me out a lot. PTSD submissions from side control. Side control is obviously a really strong attacking position, and generally speaking, it's the first place we end up when we pass guard successfully. So building an arsenal of attacks from there is strategically wise to do. Robert, what do you think are the highest percentage side control attacks that people should mostly be focusing on?
I think the ones you see most often, which are going to be the head and arm, the kimura. I do a lot of wrist locks from there. I have arthritis on both my wrists, so I can't hand fight as well as I used to. I've lost a lot of strength in my hands because of the arthritis. Oh, wow. But so I got pretty decent at wrist locks. I've been wrist locking because I don't need to use. I can just use my chest and arms. So I've been wrist locking a lot of people from side control. I think everything has the potential to work. It's also a matter of practice and opportunity. But there are some things that are high percentage. I've been battling with people for years to try to get statistics on jiu-jitsu so we know what's happening instead of wondering what's happening, right? We have them for MMA, but we don't have them for jiu-jitsu. But I think that the head and arm, the kimura, are probably the two top submissions from side control. Maybe I'm missing something, but north-south, I get a lot of north-south too, especially in no-gi, not so much in the gi. It's one thing I advise people is you have to have that machine gun mentality. So you're actively controlling, you're not holding anyone down. Holding someone down is for pinning. If you want to submit them, you're actively controlling, and that means creating spaces for your opponent to fall into traps. So be actively attacking, actively controlling.
I appreciate the fact that you're using wrist lock. You said you have a wrist problem, so now you're applying wrist locks on others to literally make them feel your pain. I see what you're doing there, man. That's very passive. It's very passive aggressive of you, Rob. The interesting thing about side control is that it's a tremendously effective position for pinning and control, and we talked about this kind of the importance of control and pinning in this conversation. But again, it's also a great place to attack from. The tricky thing is that in order to attack, you have to relinquish some degree of the pin in order to apply most submissions. What principles do you usually encourage your students to adhere to when attacking from side control to not lose the position altogether?
Basically I said like the active control, flowing, knowing when to transition, knowing when to hold, knowing when the pressure is beating your opponent up, and when the pressure is not enough, you're actually retreating in a way where you're not in control of the situation. It's just knowing how to float the situation. I say this about guard too. I have this concept I teach. I call it active control. And I think the idea of control is misunderstood. It's like it creates a lot of confusion in grappling because people think of a pin, and like pinning is not something. I mean, sometimes you're fighting the drunk uncle on Thanksgiving and you want to hold them down. Sure, you got to hold them down. Or if you're in judo and wrestling, it's different. But if you're talking about an MMA or jiu-jitsu setting, which is my background, then you're talking about actively controlling your opponent. You want to create openings to either strike them or to create submissions or both. So those openings are created by actively moving, not trying to keep him in one place, not just for stalling purposes, but also because if you don't move and he doesn't move, well, nothing happens. So you're learning how to transition, knowing when to retreat, knowing when to advance, knowing when to go north-south, knowing how to adjust to your opponent's anatomy. If you're going against a 400-pound sumo wrestler, you probably don't want to mount them, right? So little things like that. It's just like adjusting your game according to your opponent's skill level and anatomy and your skill level and anatomy. Keeping it, if you're a competition setting, keeping in mind the score and the time. These things are extremely important when it comes to deciding whether you're going to go left or right. Like you have to look at the score, the time, your skill set, your opponent's skill set, your anatomy, and your relation to your opponent's anatomy. And you look at all that, and then you have to come up with a decision in a split second. It's very hard to do because even in the gym, it's hard to do. In competition, it's but that's what makes a good competitor, is making the right decisions at the right time.
Well, guys, anyone out there that's looking to improve their side control, this instructional has been personally helping me a lot because I'll find myself passing guard and getting to side control against people that I consider to be very good at jiu-jitsu, and then I get stuck. I'll have a couple options I go for, and if those don't work, it's great that I'm on top. It's great that I'm in a winning position, but I'm I was having brain freezes from there. So this instructional has helped me a ton. PTSD submissions from side control available right now at bjjfanatics.com. You guys go check it out. Rob, in closing, man, what are some of your major goals for 2024? What are some things you hope to accomplish this year?
I'm restructuring my gym. I'm teaching almost all classes now. I'm far more involved in my gym than ever. I'm rebuilding my competition team, starting with white belts. That's where you start. We start with white belts because that's the heavy lifting. I think there's more merit in that, so I enjoy getting someone that doesn't know what an armbar is and helping them win a NAGA, helping them win BJJF Open, American Nationals, maybe making them a world champion one day. I get satisfaction from doing that. So that's one of my goals. The other one is I'm working on a third book now. It's about, it's loosely titled The Problems of Martial Arts, where I'm making a critique of various martial arts and their way of thinking. Some of the things we've discussed here. I have my idea of what the right values are, what the right techniques are, and what a martial art should be striving for. But I don't, it's still like, today is my writing day. It's day 2 of writing. So it might be another 6 months before I'm done, but that's what I'm working on right now.
I can't wait to read the next book. Everyone you've put out so far has just been awesome. So really looking forward to the next one. And Rob, I really do appreciate you taking the time to be here, man. I know you got a busy schedule. It's always a pleasure getting to chat with you and catch up. So you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure.
Of course. For anyone out there that wants to keep up with Robert, it's real easy to do so. He's active on Facebook. He's got an athlete page there. You can follow there. He's active on X, formerly Twitter, Robert Drysdale. Instagram is Robert Drysdale JJ. YouTube is robertdrysdale.net. If you guys type in Robert Drysdale, you'll find his YouTube channel. Hit subscribe, hit the little bell icon to get notified when he adds new videos. The website is robertdrysdale.net. And then guys, if you guys are ever going through Las Vegas, he's got probably the premier academy academy in Las Vegas, Zenith Jiu-Jitsu. Drop in, get some good training. If you can't make it to Vegas, you can learn from Robert anywhere in the world. He's actually got 2 instructionals with us at BJJ Fanatics. The one that we covered in detail today was PTSD submissions from side control. So go to BJJ Fanatics and check those out. And that's going to do it for this episode, everybody. I really appreciate you tuning in. Please stay tuned for the next episode of the BJJ Fanatics podcast.